The wind howled like a banshee across Highway 84 as 73-year-old Dorothy Mae Henderson watched 15 leather-clad strangers stumble through her front door, their Harley-Davidsons buried under 3 feet of unexpected snow in her driveway. Ice crystals clung to their beards and battle-worn faces as they stood dripping in her modest living room, these hardened members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club who had never asked anyone for help in their lives. But Mother Nature had other plans that December night, trapping them miles from shelter, with temperatures plummeting toward deadly levels. What Dorothy didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her simple act of kindness would trigger a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but an entire community. Because when morning broke and the snow cleared, 100 motorcycles would line her street like chrome sentinels, carrying riders from every corner of 3 states who had heard the story of the little old lady who opened her heart to strangers in their darkest hour. This is the story of how one night of compassion created a brotherhood that would last forever. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of unexpected friendship travels across the world. The storm had been building for hours, but Dorothy Mae Henderson paid it no mind as she moved through her evening routine in the small farmhouse that had been her home for 47 years. At 73, she had weathered enough Montana winters to know the difference between a typical snowfall and something more serious, but the weather reports had called for light flurries. Nothing more than a dusting that would make the morning commute a little slower for the few folks who still bothered driving the back roads through Clearwater County. The house itself seemed to hunker down against the gathering wind, its thick log walls and stone chimney built to withstand whatever the Rocky Mountain climate could deliver. Harold had constructed it himself back in 1976. Every board and shingle placed with the meticulous care of a man who understood that in this remote corner of Montana, your home wasn't just shelter, it was your survival. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, the closest town was Whitefish population 3,200, and when the weather turned nasty, you were on your own until spring decided to show mercy. Dorothy moved through the familiar rooms with the efficient grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the rhythm of solitary life. Harold had been gone for 12 years now, claimed by a heart attack while checking on their cattle during a mild February morning, and she had learned to fill the silence with purposeful activity. The wood-burning stove needed feeding every few hours, the generator required daily maintenance, and the emergency supplies in the basement demanded regular inventory. These weren't chores so much as rituals, connections to the practical wisdom that had kept generations of frontier families alive in country that didn't forgive mistakes. The kitchen was her command center during the long winter months, its windows offering a panoramic view of the valley that stretched toward the Canadian border. She could see the weather coming from 20 miles away, watch the clouds build and darken as they rolled down from the Continental Divide. Tonight, something felt different about the approaching storm. The wind carried a sharper edge, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour. The mercury in her outdoor thermometer read 8 degrees, and falling well below the 20-degree forecast that had lulled her into thinking this would be another routine winter evening. At 7:43 p.m., the first motorcycle appeared on the distant horizon, its single headlight cutting through the swirling snow like a defiant star. Dorothy paused in her knitting, a wool sweater she was making for her grandson in Seattle, and watched with growing concern as the bike struggled against the mounting wind. 15 minutes later, a second headlight appeared, then a third, until she counted 15 motorcycles fighting their way up the valley road that led past her property. The lead rider was a mountain of a man called Bear McKenzie, president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, based out of Missoula. At 58, Bear had been riding for 40 years, had crossed the country dozens of times on bikes that ranged from pristine touring machines to rebuilt wrecks held together with determination and duct tape. He had survived blizzards in the Dakotas, sandstorms in Nevada, and flash floods in Texas, but the storm that was building around them now felt different, meaner, more personal, like nature had a specific grudge against anyone foolish enough to be caught in the open. Behind Bear rode his closest brother's Tank Wilson, a soft-spoken mechanic, whose gentle demeanor belied his 6'6" frame. Preacher Davidson, an ex-military chaplain whose faith had been tested by 3 tours in Afghanistan, and Wheels Morrison, a former long-haul trucker who could navigate by starlight and knew every back road from Seattle to Miami. They were leading a mixed group of club members on their annual December ride to Glacier National Park, a tradition that honored fallen brothers by visiting the remote mountain lakes where their ashes had been scattered. The ride had begun in perfect weather, 60 degrees, and sunny in Missoula, with forecasts calling for clear skies and light winds throughout their 3-day journey. They had made good time through the Flathead Valley, stopped for lunch in Kalispell, and were planning to camp near Lake McDonald before tackling the more challenging mountain passes. But weather in Montana could change with the unpredictability of a slot machine, and by 4 p.m., the clear skies had given way to ominous clouds that seemed to boil up from the earth itself. "Bear, we need to find shelter." Tank's voice crackled through the helmet radio, barely audible above the howling wind. "Temperature's dropping fast, and this snow's getting heavier every mile." Bear could feel it, too. The way his Harley was fighting the crosswinds, the sting of ice crystals against his face shielded the growing numbness in his fingers, despite his insulated gloves. They were still 30 miles from their planned campsite, but the road ahead was climbing into higher elevation, where conditions would only get worse. He had made the decision to turn back toward Whitefish when the storm intensified beyond anything he had experienced in 4 decades of riding. "Next shelter we see," Bear responded through his radio. "I don't care if it's a barn or a bus stop. We're not making it to town in this." The wind gusted to what felt like 50 miles per hour, strong enough to push the heavy touring bikes sideways across the icy asphalt. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards as the snow changed from flakes to pellets, then to the kind of horizontal sleet that could blind a rider in seconds. The temperature gauge on Bear's dashboard showed -2 degrees and falling well into the range where exposed skin could freeze in minutes. That's when they saw the light. Dorothy's farmhouse appeared through the storm like a beacon of hope, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the white chaos that surrounded them. The long driveway was already accumulating snow, but it looked passable if they moved quickly. Bear didn't hesitate. He signaled his intentions to the riders behind him and turned toward the house, his Harley's engine growling with relief as they left the exposed highway for the relative shelter of the tree-lined drive. Dorothy watched them approach with a mixture of concern and curiosity. 15 motorcycles struggling through a blizzard was not something you saw every day, even in a part of the country where unusual events were simply part of life's rhythm. She could see the riders hunched over their machines, fighting the wind and cold, with the desperate determination of people who understood they were in serious danger. The lead motorcycle reached her front porch just as the storm reached its full fury. Wind speeds that would later be measured at 73 miles per hour drove the snow horizontally across the valley, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet. The temperature plummeted to -12 degrees, cold enough to kill anyone caught outside without proper shelter. Bear dismounted his bike with the stiff movements of someone whose body was shutting down from cold exposure. His face was blue beneath his helmet, ice crystals forming on his beard and eyebrows. Behind him, his brothers were in similar condition. Big, tough men reduced to shivering shadows, by the relentless assault of wind and cold. Dorothy didn't hesitate. She opened her front door and called out through the howling storm, "Get yourselves inside before you freeze to death. Bring whatever you need from those bikes." The riders looked at each other with expressions that mixed gratitude with embarrassment. These were men who had spent their lives projecting strength and independence, who took pride in handling whatever challenges the road threw at them without asking for help from anyone. But pride was a luxury they couldn't afford when hypothermia was setting in, and the nearest alternative shelter was 20 miles away through impassable conditions. Bear was the first to respond, grabbing his saddlebags and heading for Dorothy's front door with movements that betrayed his desperation. "Ma'am, we don't want to impose, but if we could just wait out the worst of this storm." "Nonsense," Dorothy interrupted, ushering him inside with the no-nonsense authority of someone who had spent decades managing crises. "You'll wait out all of it, and you'll do it where it's warm and safe. Now get the rest of your friends before they turn into icicles." One by one, the Iron Wolves filed into Dorothy's living room, their leather jackets and heavy boots dripping melted snow onto her hardwood floors. Tank Wilson had to duck to clear the doorframe, his massive frame making the modest farmhouse feel suddenly crowded. Preacher Davidson removed his helmet to reveal prematurely white hair and the kind of 1,000-yard stare that spoke of too many difficult experiences. Wheels. Morrison carried a guitar case along with his riding gear, never traveling anywhere without his music. The younger members of the group followed their leaders inside Jake Slider Thompson, a 26-year-old computer programmer who had joined the club after his deployment in Iraq. Maria Santos, one of only 3 women in the Iron Wolves, and a paramedic who carried medical supplies for the entire group. Bobby Kid Chen, a former gang member from San Francisco who had found family and purpose in the motorcycle club. And 8 other riders whose stories ranged from corporate executives seeking weekend adventure to blue-collar workers who had been riding together for decades. Dorothy took in the scene with the practical assessment of someone accustomed to managing unexpected situations. 15 people would strain her resources, but the alternative, sending them back into the storm, was unthinkable. The house had 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a finished basement. With some creative arrangement and a willingness to sacrifice privacy for survival, everyone could be accommodated. "First things first," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been making life-or-death decisions since these riders were children. "Everyone out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia. Tank, you and the other big fellows, there's a stack of Harold's old work shirts and pants in the bedroom closet. They should fit well enough. The rest of you, I've got quilts and blankets in the hall linen closet. We'll get you dry and warm, then worry about everything else." Bear started to protest the imposition, but Dorothy cut him off with a look that reminded him of his own grandmother, a woman who had raised 7 children during the Great Depression and wouldn't tolerate arguments when practical matters were at stake. "Son, I've lived through 47 Montana winters in this house. I know the difference between a bad storm and a killer storm. This is a killer storm, and you're staying put until it passes. Now stop arguing and start getting warm." The transformation that followed was remarkable in its efficiency. Dorothy moved through her house like a general organizing a military operation, assigning sleeping arrangements, distributing dry clothes, and starting preparations for feeding 15 unexpected guests. Tank and Preacher were directed to the basement, where they could string clotheslines for wet gear and set up sleeping areas on air mattresses Dorothy retrieved from storage. Maria Santos, with her medical training, was tasked with checking everyone for signs of hypothermia or frostbite. Wheels. Morrison positioned himself near the wood-burning stove with his guitar, his fingers too numb from cold to play, but his spirits lifted by the promise of warmth and shelter. Jake Thompson and Bobby Chen worked together to move furniture and create open floor space where sleeping bags could be arranged. The older members of the group, men who had been riding together for 20 years or more, fell into the familiar rhythm of making camp, the only difference being that tonight their camp was inside a stranger's living room instead of beside a mountain stream. "Ma'am," Bear said as Dorothy bustled past, carrying an armload of quilts, "I need you to know that we're not charity cases. We carry cash, and we'll pay for whatever this costs you. Food utilities, the inconvenience. The Iron Wolves take care of their debts." Dorothy paused in her activities and studied Bear's face, seeing past the intimidating leather and tattoos to the fundamental decency that had made him the leader these men chose to follow. "What's your name, son?" "They call me Bear. Bear Mackenzie." "Well, Bear Mackenzie, my name is Dorothy Henderson, and in my house hospitality isn't a business transaction. You're not guests who owe me money. You're fellow human beings who got caught in a bad storm. When the weather breaks and you're back on the road, the only debt you'll owe is to help someone else who finds themselves in similar trouble." The simple dignity of her response hit Bear harder than any sermon about brotherhood or loyalty he had ever heard in his 20 years as club president. This elderly woman living alone in a remote farmhouse had opened her home to 15 strangers without hesitation or conditions, asking nothing in return except that they pay the kindness forward when circumstances allowed. Harold always said that Montana hospitality wasn't about being nice to people when it was convenient. Dorothy continued resuming her distribution of blankets. It was about being decent to folks when it really mattered, when lives depended on it. Tonight, your lives depend on having warm shelter and hot food. Tomorrow, when the storm passes, maybe someone else will need what you can provide. As the evening progressed, the initial awkwardness between Dorothy and her unexpected guests gradually gave way to something approaching family dynamics. The riders shed their wet leather in favor of Harold's old work clothes and Dorothy's collection of quilts, their intimidating appearance softened by flannel shirts and hand-knitted sweaters that had been waiting years in closets and drawers for someone who needed them. Dorothy proved to be a master of emergency cooking, transforming basic ingredients into meals that could feed a crowd. She had Tank and Preacher help her bring preserved vegetables up from the root cellar, opened canned goods she had been storing for years, and began preparing what she called Harold's famous storm stew, a hearty mixture of beef potatoes and vegetables that could stretch to feed any number of people. "Used to make this every time the weather got nasty and the neighbors needed feeding," she explained as she worked. Harold would say that bad weather brought out either the best or the worst in people, and he was determined that anyone who came to our door would see the best. The smell of cooking food filled the farmhouse, mixing with the wood smoke from the stove to create an atmosphere of warmth and comfort that seemed to wrap around the displaced riders like a protective embrace. Wheels. Morrison's fingers had thawed enough to play his guitar, and he began working through a repertoire of country classics that had everyone humming along. Maria Santos and Jake Thompson found common ground in their military experiences, swapping stories about deployments and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. "This is something else," Preacher Davidson murmured to Bear, as they watched Dorothy orchestrate the evening's activities with the grace of someone who had been managing large groups her entire life. "When's the last time you saw hospitality like this? No questions, no conditions, just pure human decency." Bear nodded, understanding that they were witnessing something rare in their modern world. Kindness without agenda, generosity without expectation of return. The Iron Wolves had spent years building a reputation based on loyalty to their own kind, protection of their territory, and suspicion of outsiders. Dorothy Henderson was teaching them a different model of human interaction, one based on simple compassion for fellow travelers facing difficult circumstances. As midnight approached the house, settled into the quiet rhythm of people adjusting to shared space and unexpected intimacy. The storm continued its assault, outside wind howling around the eaves and snow piling against the windows in drifts that would reach 6 feet by morning. But inside Dorothy's farmhouse, 15 strangers had become something approaching family, bound together by circumstance and the simple human recognition that survival sometimes required trusting others. Dorothy made her final rounds at 12:30 a.m., checking that everyone had adequate blankets and pillow substitutes, that the wood stove was properly banked for the night, and that her guests understood where to find anything they might need during the dark hours ahead. She paused beside Bear, who was settled on the couch with a view of both the front door and the sleeping areas where his brothers were arranged. "Get some rest," she said quietly. "Storm should break by morning, and you'll want to check your bikes before you get back on the road." "Mrs. Henderson," Bear replied, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "I don't know how to thank you for this. What you've done tonight, it's more than hospitality. You saved our lives." Dorothy smiled and patted his shoulder with the gentle affection of a grandmother. Harold used to say that kindness was like a campfire. It didn't cost anything to share, and it made everyone warmer. You boys just happened to need warming on a cold night. Sleep well, and don't worry about thanking me. Just remember this feeling and pass it on when you get the chance. As Dorothy retreated to her bedroom, Bear looked around at his brothers sleeping peacefully in a stranger's home, protected by nothing more than an old woman's compassion and sense of human decency. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of nature, unleashed temperatures dropping to levels that would have killed them all if they had remained exposed. Inside, surrounded by the gentle snores of men who had found unexpected sanctuary, Bear Mackenzie began to understand that sometimes the most profound brotherhood wasn't forged in bars or on dangerous roads, but in quiet moments when strangers chose to care for each other simply because it was the right thing to do. The wood stove crackled softly in the darkness, its warm light playing across faces that had been transformed by the evening's experience. These men had begun the day as members of an outlaw motorcycle club, defined by their independence and separation from conventional society. They would wake up tomorrow as something different, ambassadors of a kindness they had never expected to receive, carriers of a story that would change how they understood the relationship between strength and gentleness, between loyalty and love. But first, they would sleep peacefully under quilts made by hands they had never seen in a house, built by a man they had never met, protected by a woman whose only payment was the satisfaction of knowing she had chosen compassion over fear when circumstances demanded a choice. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but the memory of this night would endure for the rest of their lives, a reminder that humanity's greatest strength wasn't found in intimidation or isolation, but in the simple willingness to open doors when fellow travelers needed shelter from life's unexpected tempests. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the valley, but inside Dorothy Henderson's farmhouse, 15 strangers discovered that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't nature's fury or human strength. It was an old woman's gentle insistence that everyone deserved warmth, food, and safety when darkness fell and the temperature dropped toward deadly levels. The first pale light of dawn crept through Dorothy's kitchen windows at 6:15 a.m., revealing a transformed landscape that looked like something from another planet. Snow had drifted against the house in waves 8 feet high, and the 15 Harley-Davidsons in her driveway had become abstract sculptures of chrome and steel buried beneath pristine white mounds. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime around 4 a.m., leaving behind the kind of crystalline silence that only follows nature's most violent tantrums. Dorothy was already awake, had been since 5:30, moving quietly through her morning routine while her guests slept. The wood stove needed feeding, coffee required brewing, and breakfast for 16 people demanded more planning than her usual bowl of oatmeal and toast. She had learned decades ago that the secret to managing large groups was to start early and think 3 steps ahead, lessons that proved invaluable when feeding ranch hands during harvest season or hosting family reunions that lasted for days. The coffee was percolating, and bacon was sizzling in her largest cast-iron skillet when Bear stirred on the couch, his internal clock responding to the familiar sounds of morning preparation. At 58, he had long since lost the ability to sleep past sunrise, a habit developed during 30 years of construction work that began at dawn regardless of weather or personal preference. He sat up carefully, his back protesting the night spent on furniture not designed for 6'2" frames, and took in the scene around him. His brothers were still sleeping peacefully beneath Dorothy's quilts, their bearded faces relaxed in ways he rarely saw during their waking hours. Tank Wilson was curled up in Harold's old recliner, his massive frame somehow folded into the chair like a gentle giant taking a nap. Preacher Davidson had claimed a spot near the wood stove, his military discipline evident even in sleep, as he remained flat on his back with his hands folded across his chest. Wheels Morrison had ended up on the floor beside his guitar case, one calloused hand still resting on the instrument, as if he had fallen asleep mid-song. "Morning, Bear," Dorothy called softly from the kitchen. "Hope the smell of coffee didn't wake you. Old habits die hard, and I've been getting up with the sun for more years than I care to count." Bear stood and stretched, working out the kinks in his spine as he made his way toward the kitchen. Through the window, he could see the full extent of the storm's impact. Snow piled higher than he had ever witnessed, wind-carved drifts that would take days to melt, and a landscape so pristine and untouched it seemed almost sacred in the morning light. "Ma'am, I've got to say that's about the most beautiful disaster I've ever seen," Bear said, accepting the steaming mug of coffee Dorothy offered him. "We'd have been dead inside an hour if you hadn't taken us in. No question about it." Dorothy followed his gaze out the window, taking in the transformed valley with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed 47 similar transformations. Harold used to say that Montana storms were like life. They could be beautiful and terrible at the same time, and survival depended on finding the right shelter when things got rough. Bear sipped his coffee and felt the warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the lingering chill that seemed to have settled in his bones during the night. The brew was strong and rich, the kind of coffee that could wake the dead and keep working men alert through 16-hour days. It tasted like civilization, like home, like everything good about human hospitality distilled into a ceramic mug. "How long have you been living out here alone?" Bear asked, curious about the woman who had shown such extraordinary generosity to strangers. 12 years since Harold passed," Dorothy replied, cracking eggs into a bowl with the efficient movements of someone who had prepared thousands of breakfasts. "Folks keep telling me I should move to town, get one of those little apartments where everything's convenient. But this place holds too many good memories to abandon. Besides, somebody needs to be here when travelers get caught in storms like last night." Bear heard the underlying message in her words. Dorothy Henderson wasn't living in isolation by accident or necessity, but by choice and purpose. She remained in her remote farmhouse specifically to serve as a refuge for people who found themselves in desperate circumstances, a lighthouse keeper tending her beacon for mariners lost in life's unexpected tempests. "Seems like you've made it into something of a calling," Bear observed. "Harold and I never had children." Dorothy explained, her voice carrying the weight of old sorrows that had been transformed into different kinds of purpose. But we figured there were plenty of ways to leave something good behind. This house, this hospitality, maybe it's our way of being parents to folks who need taking care of." The conversation was interrupted by stirring from the living room as the other iron wolves began responding to the smell of cooking bacon and the sound of quiet voices. Maria Santos was the first to emerge fully awake, her paramedic training having conditioned her to transition instantly from sleep to full alertness when circumstances required action. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Maria said immediately, moving to help with breakfast preparations. "What can I do to help? I'm pretty good with large-scale cooking from my time in the service." "Bless you, dear," Dorothy replied, handing Maria a wooden spoon and pointing toward a pot of hash browns that needed stirring. "Most people want to help by staying out of the way, but what I really need is extra hands. Think you can handle scrambling eggs for 15 hungry bikers?" Maria grinned and accepted the challenge, understanding that Dorothy was offering her partnership rather than charity. The two women fell into easy rhythm, decades of experience allowing them to coordinate their efforts without stepping on each other's feet or duplicating work. One by one, the other riders joined the gathering in Dorothy's kitchen, drawn by curiosity and caffeine dependency. Jake Thompson proved surprisingly adept at making toast his computer programmer's attention to detail, ensuring that every slice achieved perfect golden brown consistency. Bobby Chen took over bacon duty, his former gang experience having taught him that cooking for large groups was a survival skill worth mastering. Tank Wilson and Preacher Davidson focused on clearing snow from the front porch and walkways, their construction backgrounds making them natural choices for physical labor. Wheels Morrison appointed himself entertainment coordinator, tuning his guitar and working through a repertoire of breakfast-appropriate songs that wouldn't offend their elderly hostess's sensibilities. "This is something else," Slider Thompson murmured to Bobby Chen as they watched Dorothy orchestrate the morning activities with the grace of a conductor leading a symphony. "When's the last time you saw 15 tough guys turn into helpful house guests overnight?" Bobby nodded thoughtfully, remembering his years with the San Francisco gang, where kindness was viewed as weakness and accepting help was considered betrayal. "Never, man. Where I came from, you'd be lucky if your own brothers helped you when you were down. This lady doesn't even know our names and she's treating us like family." The breakfast that emerged from Dorothy's kitchen was a masterpiece of frontier cooking. Scrambled eggs, fluffy enough to float bacon crispy, but not burned hash browns, golden, and seasoned with herbs from her garden, and biscuits that could have won prizes at any county fair. The dining room table wasn't large enough for 16 people, so they ate in shifts with Dorothy, insisting that her guests be served first, while she managed logistics from the kitchen. "Mrs. Henderson," Preacher Davidson said during the second seating, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me a straight answer." Dorothy looked up from refilling coffee cups, her expression attentive but cautious. "What's on your mind?" "Why?" Preacher's question was simple but profound. "Why did you open your door to us, the 15 strangers on motorcycles showing up in the middle of a blizzard? Most people would have called the sheriff and locked their doors. You invited us in and fed us like we were long-lost relatives. I'm struggling to understand that kind of trust." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain a worldview that had been shaped by decades of frontier living and prairie values that seemed increasingly rare in modern America. "Preacher, is that really your name or just what folks call you?" "Both, I guess. David Davidson, but I've been preacher since my Army chaplain days. Seemed to stick when I got out and started writing." "Well, Preacher Davidson, I suppose it comes down to faith. Not necessarily the religious kind, though Harold and I were church-going people, but faith in the basic decency of human beings. Faith that most folks, when push comes to shove, want to do right by each other." She paused to refill his coffee cup, organizing her thoughts. "Harold used to say that fear makes people stupid, makes them see enemies where there might be friends. Last night I could have looked out that window and seen 15 dangerous strangers who might rob me or worse. Or I could see 15 fellow human beings who were about to freeze to death if somebody didn't help them. The choice I made says more about me than it does about you." Bear, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, felt something shift in his understanding of courage and strength. For 20 years, he had led the Iron Wolves based on the principle that power came from intimidation, that respect was earned through the demonstration of superior force. Dorothy Henderson was teaching him a different model, one where strength was measured by the willingness to be vulnerable, where real power came from lifting others up rather than putting them down. "Ma'am," Bear said, "I think you might be the bravest person I've ever met." Dorothy laughed, a sound like silver bells that seemed to fill the farmhouse with warmth more effective than any wood stove. "Brave son, I'm just a lonely old woman who was grateful for the company. You boys brought more life into this house than it's seen since Harold passed. If anything, I should be thanking you for the best evening I've had in years." The morning progressed with the easy rhythm of people who had discovered unexpected compatibility. Dorothy shared stories about Harold and their life together on the remote farm, painting pictures of barn raisings and harvest celebrations of neighbors helping neighbors through droughts and floods and economic hardships that would have broken lesser communities. The Iron Wolves, in turn, began opening up about their own lives and the brotherhood they had forged on highways and in roadhouses across the American West. Bear talked about his construction business and the satisfaction of building things that would outlast him. Tank shared memories of his late wife and the garage they had run together before cancer claimed her. Preacher described his military service and the spiritual questions that had driven him to seek answers on back roads and mountain passes. "You know what strikes me most about you boys?" Dorothy said during a lull in the conversation. "You've created something beautiful together. Not just a motorcycle club, but a real family. Men who take care of each other, who show up when it matters." Harold would have understood that completely. Maria Santos, who had been quietly absorbing the morning's revelations, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, dear." "Do you ever get scared, living out here alone, I mean? No neighbors close by, no quick way to get help if something goes wrong." Dorothy considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I suppose I should be more scared than I am. But Harold and I chose this place specifically because it was remote, because it required self-reliance and attracted the kind of people who understood the value of that independence. The folks who end up on this road are usually either lost or running toward something better. Either way, they tend to be people worth knowing." She gestured toward the snow-covered landscape visible through her windows. "Besides, fear is a luxury I can't afford. If I spent my time worrying about what might go wrong, I'd miss out on all the good things that actually happen. Like last night." By mid-morning, the immediate challenge became digging out the motorcycles and assessing damage from the storm. The snow had drifted so deep that only the handlebars and windshields were visible on most of the bikes, creating an excavation project that would require hours of careful work. Bear organized his brothers into teams. Some focused on digging, while others worked on clearing a path to the main road. Dorothy watched the operation from her kitchen window, marveling at the efficiency and cooperation these men demonstrated when working together. There was no arguing about assignments, no shirking of responsibilities, just the kind of seamless teamwork that came from years of shared challenges and mutual trust. "Tank, you and Slider take the bikes on the left side," Bear directed. "Preacher and Wheels, you've got the right side. Bobby and Jake. I need you to scout the road and see how bad the drifting is between here and the highway. Maria, can you do a medical check on everyone before we start heavy lifting? Last thing we need is someone throwing out their back." The work proceeded with methodical precision, each motorcycle carefully excavated and inspected for damage. Remarkably, the heavy machines had weathered the storm better than anyone had expected. A few cracked windshields, some ice in the fuel lines, but nothing that couldn't be repaired with basic tools and patience. Dorothy insisted on providing regular breaks with hot coffee and sandwiches, treating the work crew like ranch hands during a busy season. She had lived through enough emergencies to understand that keeping people fed and warm was essential to maintaining morale and preventing accidents. Mrs. Henderson? Jake Thompson called out during one of these breaks. I've got to say, watching you manage all this reminds me of my grandmother back in Ohio. She could organize a barn raising or a church social with the same kind of efficiency. Women like you and her, you're the ones who really hold communities together. That's sweet of you to say, Jake, but I think you're giving me too much credit. I'm just doing what needs doing, same as you boys with your digging and fixing. The difference between surviving and thriving usually comes down to people being willing to pitch in when the situation calls for it. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that while the motorcycles could be made roadworthy, the access road to Dorothy's property would remain impassable for at least another day. Snow had drifted across the valley road, in some places, to depths of 12 feet or more, and without heavy equipment, there was no way to clear a path wide enough for safe travel. "Looks like you're stuck with us for another night," Bear told Dorothy as he delivered this assessment. "I know that's an imposition, but—" "Nonsense," Dorothy interrupted firmly. "You think I'm going to send you out on that road before it's safe? Harold would roll over in his grave if I let guests leave before the danger passed. Besides, I'm enjoying the company more than you know." That evening's dinner was an even more elaborate affair, with Dorothy pulling out family recipes that hadn't been used since Harold's funeral reception. She taught Maria how to make her grandmother's cornbread, showed Jake the secret to perfectly seasoned pot roast, and enlisted Tank's help with homemade apple pie that filled the house with the scents of cinnamon and brown sugar. The conversation around the dinner table revealed depths and complexities that surprised everyone involved. These weren't the stereotypical outlaw bikers of popular imagination, but thoughtful men and women who had chosen an alternative lifestyle while maintaining strong moral codes and genuine concern for each other's welfare. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Wheels Morrison said as he helped clear dishes after the meal. "How different this has been from what I expected. When we pulled into your driveway last night, I figured we'd impose on your hospitality for a few hours, then hit the road as soon as the storm passed. But this feels like— I don't know how to describe it. Feels like coming home," Preacher supplied quietly. "Feels like finding family you didn't know you had." Dorothy paused in her dishwashing, struck by the profound simplicity of Preacher's observation. That's exactly what it is. Family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about people who show up for each other when it matters most. As the second evening progressed, the bonds between Dorothy and her unexpected guests continued to deepen. Stories were shared that revealed scars and triumphs, dreams deferred, and goals achieved against long odds. The Iron Wolves learned about Dorothy's career as a teacher in the one-room schoolhouse that had served their remote valley for 30 years. Dorothy discovered that her guests included a former corporate executive who had walked away from a 7-figure salary to find meaning on the open road, a military veteran who used motorcycle rallies to raise money for wounded warriors, and a grandmother who rode with her late husband's club to honor his memory. "This has been the most remarkable 2 days of my life," Dorothy confided to Bear as they sat by the wood stove after the others had retired for the night. "I've lived in this valley for 47 years, and I thought I knew what hospitality meant. But you and your friends have taught me something new about the power of human connection." Bear studied Dorothy's face in the flickering light, seeing past the wrinkles and gray hair to the vibrant spirit that had transformed 15 strangers into something approaching family in the space of 36 hours. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something. What you've given us isn't just shelter and food. You've given us a model for how to live, how to treat people, how to be better than what the world expects from us." "How do you mean?" "The Iron Wolves have always prided ourselves on loyalty to our own, on taking care of our brothers and sisters. But our definition of family has been pretty narrow. Club members only earned through initiation and proved through years of riding together. You've shown us that family can be broader than that kindness doesn't have to be earned or deserved. Sometimes it just is." Dorothy reached over and patted Bear's hand with the gentle affection of a grandmother. "You boys were already good men when you arrived here. All I did was give you a warm place to recognize what was already true about yourselves." Outside, the Montana night was crystal clear stars, brilliant in the thin mountain air above snow that would take weeks to fully melt. Inside Dorothy Henderson's farmhouse, 15 members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club slept peacefully for the second night. But their dreams had changed. Where once they had dreamed of roads and freedom and the next adventure waiting beyond the horizon, now they dreamed of home and family and the kind of love that asked nothing in return except the promise to pass it forward when the opportunity arose. The morning would bring clear roads and operational motorcycles, the practical necessities that would allow them to continue their interrupted journey. But it would also bring the recognition that they were no longer the same people who had sought shelter from an unexpected storm. They had become ambassadors of a different way of living, carriers of a story that would transform not just their own understanding of brotherhood, but the lives of countless others who would hear about the night when a lonely old woman opened her door to strangers and discovered that the greatest adventures don't always happen on the road. The third morning dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed major storms, as if nature was apologizing for her previous fury by revealing the Rocky Mountains in all their snow-crowned glory. Dorothy was already moving through her kitchen routine when Bear emerged from the couch, but this time something felt different in the air. A combination of anticipation and reluctance that spoke to the inevitable approaching goodbye. The county snowplows had finally made it through the valley during the night, their rumbling engines audible in the distance as they carved paths through the massive drifts. The main road was now passable, which meant the Iron Wolves could continue their journey to Glacier National Park and the memorial service they had originally set out to attend. But the prospect of leaving Dorothy's farmhouse felt less like liberation and more like abandonment. "Road's clear," Bear announced to his brothers as they gathered around the breakfast table for what everyone understood would be their final meal together. "We can make it to Lake McDonald by early afternoon if we get moving in the next couple hours." The response was notably subdued. These were men who lived for the freedom of the open road, who measured their lives in miles traveled and adventures experienced. Yet none of them seemed eager to throw their legs over their Harley-Davidsons and roar off into the Montana wilderness. "Seems wrong somehow," Tank Wilson muttered into his coffee cup. "Leaving Mrs. Henderson here all alone after what she's done for us." Dorothy, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, entered the dining room with the decisive stride of someone who had spent decades managing reluctant departures. "Now you stop that kind of thinking right there, Tank Wilson. I was alone before you arrived, and I'll be alone after you leave, and that's exactly how I like it. You boys have memorials to attend and roads to travel. Don't you dare let an old woman's hospitality become a burden on your consciences." But even as she spoke these practical words, Dorothy's eyes betrayed the same reluctance her guests were feeling. For 3 days, her house had been filled with laughter and conversation, with the kind of purposeful activity that had been missing since Harold's death. The prospect of returning to solitary evenings and silent meals felt suddenly overwhelming. Maria Santos, with her paramedic's instinct for reading emotional undercurrents, spoke up first. "Mrs. Henderson, what if we could figure out a way to keep in touch? I mean, really keep in touch. Not just Christmas cards and birthday wishes. What if this could be the beginning of something instead of the end?" What did you have in mind, dear? Bear leaned forward, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Maria's right. This can't just be a beautiful story we tell other people. Mrs. Henderson, you've given us something precious, a model for how to treat strangers, how to create family out of unexpected circumstances. The least we can do is figure out ways to honor that gift. Dorothy sat down at the table, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. I'm listening. Jake Thompson, the computer programmer, pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts. Mrs. Henderson, do you have internet access out here? Email. Any kind of communication technology. Harold had satellite internet installed a few years before he passed, Dorothy replied. I use it mainly for weather reports and keeping up with my grandson in Seattle. Why, because we're going to create something, Jake said with growing excitement. A network, a way for people like you, people with big hearts and remote locations, to connect with travelers who might need help. Think of it as hospitality networking for the 21st century. Preacher Davidson's eyes lit up with understanding. Like a modern version of the Underground Railroad, but for folks caught in bad weather or mechanical trouble, or just needing a safe place to rest. Exactly, Jake continued. We create a website, maybe an app where people can register as hosts or find hosts when they're in trouble. Verified members' safety protocols, emergency contacts. Make it so good Samaritans like Mrs. Henderson aren't taking blind risks, and travelers aren't left to die in blizzards. Dorothy listened with growing fascination as the Iron Wolves began developing their idea in real time. These were practical people accustomed to solving problems through direct action, and she could see them applying that same mindset to the challenge of systematizing human kindness. What would you call it? She asked. Haven Network, Maria suggested immediately. Because that's what you provided for us, a haven when we needed it most. Wheels Morrison, who had been quietly tuning his guitar, looked up with a thoughtful expression. You know what else we could do? We could organize rides, not just random groups heading to tourist destinations, but purposeful rides to check on people like Mrs. Henderson. Monthly visits during good weather emergency response when conditions get bad. I like where this is going, Tank said, his enthusiasm building. My construction business is slow during winter months. I could organize work parties to help folks with maintenance projects, repairs they can't handle alone. Dorothy felt tears threatening as she listened to these hardened bikers planning ways to take care of her and others like her. The generosity was overwhelming, but more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how they viewed their relationship with the broader community. Boys, she said softly, you're talking about changing your entire club mission. Are you sure that's what you want? Bear looked around the table at his brothers, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through 20 years of riding together. Mrs. Henderson, the Iron Wolves have always been about brotherhood and loyalty. What you've shown us is that brotherhood doesn't have to stop at club membership, and loyalty doesn't have to be limited to people who wear our patches. We're talking about expanding, not changing, Preacher clarified. We'll still be the Iron Wolves, still ride together, still take care of our own, but now, our own includes a lot more people. The conversation continued through breakfast and into the morning as the Iron Wolves began laying concrete plans for their Haven network. Jake would build the website and mobile application incorporating GPS technology and emergency communication features. Maria would develop safety protocols based on her medical training and emergency response experience. Preacher would handle outreach to churches and community organizations that might want to participate. Dorothy found herself appointed as the network's first official host and primary consultant on hospitality protocols. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who had chosen isolation was about to become the central figure in a system designed to connect strangers across vast distances. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Bear said as the morning wore on and departure time approached. "Mrs. Henderson, you saved 15 lives 3 nights ago. That deserves recognition beyond just our gratitude." "I don't need recognition," Dorothy protested. "I just did what any decent person would do." "That's exactly the problem," Tank replied. "Most people wouldn't have done what you did. Most people would have been too scared or too suspicious or too inconvenienced. What you did was extraordinary, even if it felt ordinary to you." Bear stood up from the table, his expression serious. "Mrs. Henderson, I'd like to offer you something. It's not payment. You've made it clear you won't accept money. But it is recognition of what you've given us." He walked to his saddlebags, which had been sitting in Dorothy's living room for 3 days, and removed a small wooden box. When he opened it, Dorothy could see a motorcycle club patch. Not the standard Iron Wolves design, but something unique and beautiful. "We had this made for Harold's widow in Missoula," Bear explained. "She lost her husband in a riding accident 2 years ago, but the club considers her family. This patch identifies you as an honorary member of the Iron Wolves, with all the protection and support that implies." The patch was exquisite, a silver wolf's head on a dark blue background, with honorary member embroidered below in elegant script. But more than its beauty, Dorothy understood its significance. She was being offered membership in a brotherhood that had sustained these people through decades of challenges. "I'm honored," Dorothy said quietly, accepting the patch with trembling hands. "But are you sure about this? I don't ride motorcycles. I've never even been on one." "Membership in the Iron Wolves isn't about riding," Maria explained. "It's about loyalty, courage, and taking care of family. You've demonstrated all 3 better than most people who've worn our colors for years." "Wheels." Morrison grinned and gestured toward his Harley, visible through the kitchen window. "Besides, we can fix the riding part anytime you want. I'd be honored to give you your first lesson." The image of 73-year-old Dorothy Henderson learning to ride a Harley-Davidson struck everyone as simultaneously absurd and wonderful. But after 3 days of watching her navigate unexpected challenges with grace and determination, none of them doubted she could master motorcycle operation if she set her mind to it. As the Iron Wolves began the process of packing their gear and preparing their bikes for travel, Dorothy moved through her house with the purposeful activity of someone trying to memorize details. The silence that would return after their departure felt more daunting now that she had experienced the alternative. "Mrs. Henderson." Bobby Chen approached her in the kitchen, where she was packing sandwiches for their journey. "I wanted to thank you for something specific. I grew up in gang neighborhoods where kindness was seen as weakness, where helping strangers got you hurt or killed. Watching you these past few days has shown me a different way to be strong." Dorothy paused in her sandwich preparation and studied Bobby's young face, seeing past the tattoos and tough exterior to the vulnerability underneath. "What kind of different way? Strong enough to be kind, strong enough to trust people, strong enough to put other people's needs ahead of your own safety. Where I come from, that takes more courage than any gang initiation or motorcycle club prospect period." "Bobby, can I tell you something my Harold used to say?" "Yes, ma'am." "He said that real strength wasn't about being able to hurt people. Any fool with a gun could do that. Real strength was about being able to help people, especially when it cost you something to do it. You boys have that kind of strength. You just needed someone to point it out." One by one, the Iron Wolves completed their preparations and began wheeling their motorcycles from Dorothy's driveway to the cleared section of road. The machines had survived their snow burial remarkably well, requiring only minor adjustments and fuel system cleaning before roaring back to life with their familiar thunder. Jake Thompson was the last to finish his preparations, taking extra time to ensure Dorothy understood how to use the laptop computer he was leaving behind. "This is programmed with the Haven Network prototype," he explained. "You can register yourself as the first official host, start building your profile, even begin reaching out to other potential members." "What if I break it?" Dorothy asked, eyeing the sophisticated technology with rural suspicion. "Then I'll drive up here and fix it," Jake replied simply. "Mrs. Henderson, you're not getting rid of us that easily. We're family now, which means we take care of each other." The moment of actual departure arrived, with the subdued ceremony of people who understood they were ending something beautiful but necessary. Dorothy stood on her front porch, wrapped in one of Harold's old coats, watching 15 leather-clad figures prepare to mount their machines and ride back into the world that had temporarily forgotten them. "You boys be careful out there," she called out, her voice carrying the maternal authority she had never had the chance to use on children of her own. "Weather can change fast in these mountains, and I don't want to worry about you freezing to death somewhere between here and Glacier Park." Bear was the last to mount his bike, pausing for final words with the woman who had fundamentally changed his understanding of human nature. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that everything changes from here. The Iron Wolves, our relationship with communities we ride through, the way we think about family and responsibility. It all starts with what you taught us in this house." "And what did I teach you?" "That kindness is contagious. That strangers are just family we haven't met yet. That the strongest thing you can do is open your door when someone needs shelter from the storm." Dorothy felt tears threatening as Bear started his engine, the familiar rumble joining the chorus of 14 other Harley-Davidsons warming up for travel. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, the kind that came from witnessing something extraordinary disguised as something ordinary. The Iron Wolves pulled out of Dorothy's driveway in the same formation they had arrived in Bear, leading with Tank and Preacher, flanking him the rest, following in the disciplined order that spoke to years of riding together. But their destination had changed in ways that went far beyond simple geography. They were no longer just heading to a memorial service at Glacier National Park. They were embarking on a mission to transform the culture of motorcycle clubs, to create networks of mutual support that transcended traditional boundaries of class and lifestyle, to demonstrate that the strongest communities were built on inclusion rather than exclusion. Dorothy watched until the last motorcycle disappeared around the bend in her access road, the sound of their engines fading into the vast Montana silence. But the quiet that followed felt different now. Not empty, but expectant, like the pause between movements in a symphony. She walked back into her house, noting how much larger it seemed, without 15 people filling its rooms with conversation and laughter. But scattered throughout the familiar spaces were reminders of her unexpected guests. Coffee cups that had been washed but still carried the memory of shared morning's quilts, that retained the warmth of grateful strangers, a wooden patch box sitting on her mantelpiece like a promise of future adventures. The laptop computer Jake had left behind sat on her kitchen table, its screen displaying the Haven Network homepage with Dorothy Henderson listed as founding host location Alpha. Below her name was a brief description: 73-year-old widow offering emergency shelter to travelers caught in severe weather. Specializes in home cooking, practical advice, and treating strangers like family. Already 3 requests for information had appeared in her inbox, one from a motorcycle club in Wyoming asking about winter travel conditions, another from a young couple planning a cross-country road trip who wanted to know about safe stopping points, and a third from a church group in Idaho that was interested in joining the network as hosts. Dorothy stared at the screen for several minutes, understanding that her life had just taken a dramatic turn toward greater complexity and responsibility. The woman who had chosen isolation was about to become a central hub for travelers seeking connection and safety across the American West. But as she began typing her first responses, Dorothy realized that this wasn't actually a departure from the life she had built with Harold. It was a fulfillment of it. They had always believed that their remote farmhouse could serve as a beacon for people in need. Now, thanks to 15 strangers caught in a blizzard, that vision was about to become reality on a scale they never could have imagined. Outside, the Montana afternoon was fading toward evening, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and purple that took her breath away even after 47 years of similar sunsets. But tonight, instead of watching the light fade in solitude, Dorothy would be planning responses to travelers who were counting on her guidance and hospitality. The Iron Wolves were somewhere on the road to Glacier National Park, carrying her story with them like a sacred trust. By the time they reached their destination, word would have spread through the extended motorcycle community about the old woman who had opened her door to strangers and discovered that kindness multiplied when it was shared freely. But Dorothy Henderson didn't know about the phone calls Bear was already making to other club presidents, or the social media posts Maria was composing about Haven Network and its founding philosophy. She didn't know that Preacher was planning to incorporate her story into sermons at the biker churches where he sometimes spoke, or that Jake was already fielding calls from technology investors who wanted to fund the Haven Network's expansion. What Dorothy knew was that her house felt alive with possibility in ways it hadn't since Harold's death, that her computer was connecting her to people across vast distances who shared her belief in the fundamental goodness of human nature, and that somewhere out there 15 strangers had become family through the simple act of accepting shelter when they needed it most. The story that had begun with a blizzard and an act of spontaneous hospitality was evolving into something larger. A movement, a philosophy, a practical demonstration that the antidote to isolation and suspicion was radical generosity applied one stranger at a time. As Dorothy Henderson began typing her response to the Wyoming Motorcycle Club, she had no idea that their simple question about road conditions would lead to the largest gathering of motorcycles in Montana history, or that her farmhouse would soon become a pilgrimage destination for riders seeking to understand how kindness could transform both giver and receiver. But those were tomorrow's miracles. Tonight, she was simply a widow with a warm house and a welcoming heart, ready to help the next group of strangers who found themselves caught in life's unexpected storms. The first response came within hours of the Iron Wolves' departure. Dorothy was still adjusting to the silence of her empty house when the laptop chimed with an incoming message from the Wyoming Rough Riders, a motorcycle club based out of Cheyenne that had heard about the Haven Network through Bear's phone calls during the ride to Glacier Park. "Mrs. Henderson," the message began. "Bear McKenzie tells us you're the kind of person who opens doors when folks need shelter. We've got a situation down here that could use your particular brand of wisdom." Dorothy settled into Harold's old desk chair and typed her response with the careful attention of someone who understood that first impressions mattered especially when dealing with people she had never met. "I'm listening. What's the situation?" The story that unfolded over the next several exchanges was both heartbreaking and familiar. Tommy Roadkill Morrison, no relation to Wheels Morrison from the Iron Wolves, was a 19-year-old club prospect whose mother had thrown him out of the house after discovering his involvement with motorcycles. The kid was sleeping in a storage unit behind the club's garage, working part-time at a truck stop to pay for food and gas, trying to prove himself worthy of membership in an organization that represented the only family he had left. "Problem is," the Wyoming president continued in his messages, "we're not set up for raising kids. We're middle-aged men with our own problems, and Tommy needs more guidance than we know how to give. Bear said you might have thoughts about how to help someone who's fallen through the cracks." Dorothy stared at the screen for several minutes, remembering conversations with Harold about the young people who sometimes showed up at their door. Runaway teenagers, college dropouts, military veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life. They had always tried to offer practical help, along with emotional support, understanding that charity without dignity was often more harmful than helpful. "Send him to me," Dorothy typed finally. "Not permanently. I'm not equipped for that either. But for a week or two while we figure out what he really needs. Sometimes a person has to get far enough away from their problems to see them clearly." The response from Wyoming was immediate and grateful. "Ma'am, you sure about this? Tommy's a good kid, but he's been through some rough times. Anger issues, trust problems, the kind of baggage that comes from growing up in a house where love was conditional on behavior." "Harold and I fostered 3 teenagers over the years," Dorothy replied. "Never officially, just kids who needed a safe place to figure out who they wanted to become. 2 of them went on to college, 1 joined the military. All 3 send Christmas cards. I'm not afraid of anger issues and trust problems. Sometimes those are just symptoms of people who haven't been shown a better way." Within 24 hours, Tommy Morrison was on a Greyhound bus headed north to Montana, carrying everything he owned in a single duffel bag and nursing the kind of defensive skepticism that came from 18 years of disappointment. Dorothy prepared for his arrival with the same methodical attention she had shown the Iron Wolves, but this situation felt different, more complex, more personal, more laden with the possibility of lasting transformation. Tommy arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon, stepping off the bus in Whitefish, with the hunched shoulders and darting eyes of someone expecting trouble from every interaction. Dorothy was waiting for him in Harold's old pickup truck, having driven the 40-minute round trip to town, with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that reminded her of preparing for her first day of teaching. The young man who approached her vehicle was smaller than she had expected, maybe 5'8", and thin in the way that suggested irregular meals rather than athletic conditioning. His clothes were clean but worn, his motorcycle club prospect vest hanging loose on his narrow frame like borrowed authority. But his eyes held the same guarded intelligence Dorothy had seen in countless students over the years, bright minds trapped behind walls of learned defensiveness. "You, Mrs. Henderson?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had been disappointed too often to risk enthusiasm. "I am. And you must be Tommy Morrison. Throw your bag in the back and climb in. We've got a 40-minute drive ahead of us, and I'm curious to hear your story." The ride to the farmhouse began in uncomfortable silence, Tommy staring out the passenger window at the Montana landscape, while Dorothy navigated the familiar roads with practiced ease. She had learned over decades of teaching that some people needed space to become comfortable with conversation, that pushing too hard for immediate connection often backfired with defensive personalities. "Wyoming Rough Riders speak highly of you," Dorothy said finally, her tone conversational rather than interrogative. "Their president says you've been working hard to earn your membership." Tommy's response was barely audible. "Yeah, well, working hard don't always mean much. People promise things they don't deliver." Dorothy heard the pain beneath his cynicism, recognizing the voice of someone who had been let down by adults who should have protected him. "That's true. But it's also true that some people keep their promises even when it's difficult. The trick is learning to tell the difference." "How do you do that?" "Time and observation. Pay attention to what people do when they think nobody's watching. Listen to how they talk about folks who can't help them get something they want. Watch whether their actions match their words when the situation gets complicated." Tommy considered this advice as they turned onto the access road that led to Dorothy's property. The farmhouse appeared ahead of them, looking exactly as it had when the iron wolves first saw it. Warm, welcoming, substantial in the way that spoke of permanence and safety. "This is where you live?" Tommy asked, his defensive posture softening slightly. "All by yourself?" "For the past 12 years since my husband Harold passed. Before that, we shared it for 35 years. Built most of it ourselves, piece by piece, room by room. It's home." Tommy's expression shifted as they pulled into the driveway, some of his urban wariness giving way to curiosity about this remote sanctuary that had somehow become central to his immediate future. "Seems like it would get lonely." "Sometimes. But lonely and alone aren't the same thing. I've got neighbors when I need them, friends in town, family scattered across the country. And lately I've been getting visitors from all over, folks who've heard about the Haven Network and want to be part of something larger than themselves." Over the next several days, Dorothy applied the same patient hospitality to Tommy that had worked so effectively with the Iron Wolves, but adapted to the specific needs of someone whose trust had been systematically destroyed by the adults in his life. She gave him space when he needed it, engaged him in practical work that built competence and confidence, and listened without judgment to stories that revealed the depth of emotional damage he had sustained. Tommy's mother, it emerged, was a functioning alcoholic who viewed her son's motorcycle interests as personal betrayal rather than normal adolescent rebellion. His father had disappeared when Tommy was 12, leaving behind only debt and a legacy of broken promises. The Wyoming Rough Riders represented the first group of adults who had ever shown consistent interest in his well-being, but their support came with expectations and obligations that felt overwhelming to someone who had never experienced unconditional acceptance. "Sometimes I think I'm just fooling myself," Tommy confided to Dorothy. During their third evening together, his defenses finally lowered enough for genuine conversation. "Like maybe I'm not cut out for the club life. Maybe I'm just a screwed-up kid pretending to be something I'm not." Dorothy looked up from the sweater she was knitting, the same one she had been working on when the Iron Wolves arrived, and studied Tommy's face in the firelight. "What do you think club life is really about? At its core, I mean." "Brotherhood. Loyalty. Taking care of your own. Having people you can count on when things get bad. And do you want those things more than anything? Then you're exactly cut out for club life. The question isn't whether you're worthy of brotherhood. The question is whether you're ready to give brotherhood in return. Can you be loyal to people who are loyal to you? Can you take care of folks who take care of you?" Tommy was quiet for several minutes, processing Dorothy's questions with the intensity of someone who had never been asked to examine his own capacity for giving rather than just receiving. "I don't know. I mean, I want to, but what if I mess it up? What if I let people down?" "Then you apologize, make it right if you can, and try to do better next time. That's what grown-ups do, Tommy. We're all just figuring it out as we go along, making mistakes and learning from them. The people worth having in your life are the ones who give you room to be imperfect while you're learning to be better." These conversations continued throughout Tommy's stay, each one revealing new layers of his personality and potential. Dorothy discovered that beneath his defensive exterior was a young man with considerable mechanical aptitude. He repaired her temperamental generator with an intuitive understanding that impressed even Tank Wilson when she called to describe the fix. He also possessed an unexpected gift for cooking, having learned to fend for himself during his mother's worst drinking episodes. "You know what I think," Dorothy said during Tommy's second week as they worked together preparing dinner. "I think you've been so focused on proving yourself to other people that you've forgotten to develop yourself for your own sake. What do you want out of life, Tommy Morrison? Not what your mother wants, not what the club wants, but what you want." Tommy paused in his vegetable, chopping the question, catching him off guard with its simplicity and profundity. "I want to matter to someone. I want to be part of something that makes a difference. I want to know that if I disappeared tomorrow, people would notice and care." "Well, you already matter to me," Dorothy replied, matter-of-factly. "And you matter to the Wyoming Rough Riders, or they wouldn't have sent you here for help. The question is whether you're ready to start mattering to yourself." The breakthrough came during Tommy's third week, when Dorothy's laptop chimed with an urgent message from a motorcycle club in Colorado. A group of riders had been caught in an unexpected early-season snowstorm near Independence Pass, and they were requesting guidance about emergency shelter options in the area. "Tommy," Dorothy called from the kitchen, "can you come help me with something? I need someone who understands motorcycles and weather conditions." Tommy appeared immediately curious about anything that might represent useful contribution rather than charity received. Dorothy showed him the message and explained the Haven Network concept, watching his expression shift from confusion to fascination to something approaching excitement. "You mean you're like a dispatcher for people in trouble?" Tommy asked. "Connecting folks who need help with folks who can provide it." "That's part of it, but it's more than just emergency response. It's about creating community for people who spend most of their time on the road, away from traditional support systems, building networks of mutual aid that transcend geographical boundaries." Tommy studied the laptop screen with growing interest, his mechanical mind immediately grasping the practical applications of what Dorothy was describing. "This is brilliant. You could save lives with this kind of system. How many clubs are involved?" "We're still in the early stages. Maybe 20 clubs across 6 states, but growing every week. Jake Thompson. He's the computer programmer with the Iron Wolves. He's been reaching out to technology investors who want to fund expansion." "What do you need from me?" The question was asked with such earnest enthusiasm that Dorothy felt her heart skip. This was the first time since his arrival that Tommy had offered help. Rather than simply accepting it, the first indication that he was beginning to see himself as someone with valuable contributions to make. "I need someone who can help me respond to these emergency situations with the kind of practical knowledge that comes from actually being on the road. You understand weather patterns, mechanical problems, the specific challenges riders face that I might not think of." Tommy straightened in his chair, his posture shifting from defensive to engaged. "I can do that. I mean, I've been riding since I was 15, worked on bikes since I was 12. I know the roads between Wyoming and Montana like the back of my hand. Then let's get to work." The next several hours were spent crafting responses to the Colorado emergency and 3 other requests for assistance that had accumulated in Dorothy's inbox. Tommy proved to have an intuitive understanding of rider psychology and practical logistics that complemented Dorothy's natural hospitality and organizational skills perfectly. "You know what this needs?" Tommy said as they worked. "A mobile app that can push emergency alerts to registered hosts in specific geographical areas, like an Amber Alert system but for travelers in distress." Dorothy looked at him with new respect. "That's exactly what Jake Thompson has been talking about building. You should speak with him. He's always looking for people who understand both the technical and practical sides of what we're trying to accomplish." The conversation that followed, conducted via video call with Jake in Missoula, was a revelation for everyone involved. Tommy's combination of street-level riding experience and intuitive grasp of technology made him an ideal consultant for the Haven Network's development, while Jake's programming expertise could turn Tommy's practical insights into functional applications. "Tommy," Jake said as their call concluded, "I don't know what your long-term plans are, but if you're interested, I could use a partner on this project. Someone who understands the user experience from the ground up. It wouldn't be charity. It would be a real job with real responsibilities and real pay." Tommy looked at Dorothy, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and uncertainty. "What do you think, Mrs. Henderson? Could I do something like that?" "Tommy Morrison," Dorothy replied firmly. "I think you could do anything you set your mind to as long as you remember that success comes from serving others rather than just serving yourself. Jake's offering you a chance to help build something that could save lives and create community for thousands of people. That's not just a job, that's a calling." The transformation that followed was remarkable in its speed and completeness. Tommy threw himself into the Haven Network project with the passionate intensity of someone who had finally found work that aligned with his values and abilities. He spent hours each day corresponding with motorcycle clubs across the country, gathering information about common road hazards, optimal stopping points, and the specific needs of different types of riders. Within a month, Tommy had become Dorothy's unofficial assistant and Jake's primary collaborator on the technical development side of the network. His insights led to features that none of them had originally envisioned: real-time weather integration, mechanical problem diagnosis, even social networking capabilities that allowed riders to connect with others who shared their interests and travel routes. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said to Dorothy during one of their evening conversations. "6 weeks ago, I was sleeping in a storage unit wondering if anybody would ever think I was worth anything. Now I'm helping build something that could change how people treat each other on the road." "That's not funny. That's miraculous," Dorothy replied. "But the miracle isn't what happened to you, Tommy. The miracle is what you chose to do with what happened to you. You could have stayed bitter and defensive and focused on everything that had gone wrong. Instead, you decided to help make sure other people didn't have to go through what you went through." This Wyoming Rough Riders were among the first to benefit from Tommy's transformation. When they learned about his work with the Haven Network, they offered him full membership, rather than continued prospect status, not because he had completed some arbitrary set of tasks, but because he had demonstrated the kind of character they valued in permanent brothers. "It's different now," Tommy explained to Dorothy after returning from his initiation ceremony. "Before I was trying to prove I deserved to belong somewhere. Now I know I belong because of what I can contribute, not because of what I can take." As winter melted into spring, and the Haven Network continued to grow, Dorothy found herself at the center of a community that spanned thousands of miles and included people she had never met in person, but who felt like family nonetheless. Her laptop had become a lifeline connecting travelers in distress, with hosts willing to provide assistance, a communication hub that facilitated everything from emergency shelter to routine mechanical advice. But more than that, the network had become something Jake Thompson had never anticipated when he first proposed the idea. A social movement that was changing how motorcycle clubs viewed their relationship with society at large. Instead of existing in opposition to conventional communities, clubs were becoming integral parts of mutual aid networks that served everyone who traveled the nation's highways. "Mrs. Henderson," Bear McKenzie said during one of his monthly check-in calls, "I need you to understand what you've started here. We've got clubs from coast to coast joining the network, pledging to help strangers in distress. We've got emergency response times that put official authorities to shame. And we've got hundreds of people like Tommy who've found purpose and community through serving others." "It's not what I started, Bear," Dorothy corrected gently. "It's what we all built together piece by piece, relationship by relationship. I just provided the initial example." "Maybe so. But that example changed everything. Changed how we think about family, about community, about what it means to be strong enough to help people who can't help themselves." As spring turned toward summer, Dorothy began receiving visitors who came not because they needed emergency shelter, but because they wanted to pay their respects to the woman who had inspired the Haven Network. They came in small groups, 2 or 3 riders at a time, bringing gifts of gratitude and stories about how the network had touched their lives. There was the young couple from Oregon, who had been stranded with mechanical problems in Nevada and rescued by network hosts who not only fixed their bike, but gave them a place to stay while parts were shipped from Portland. There was the military veteran from Texas who had been contemplating suicide until a network host took the time to listen to his story and help him find professional counseling. There was the grandmother from Michigan who had joined as a host and discovered that helping stranded travelers gave her life new meaning after her husband's death from cancer. Each visitor brought pieces of a larger story about how individual acts of kindness coordinated through technology and sustained by genuine human connection were creating something unprecedented, a nationwide community of mutual support that transcended traditional boundaries of geography class and lifestyle. "You know what amazes me most?" Tommy said to Dorothy one evening, as they watched another group of visiting riders prepare to continue their journey. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that motorcycle clubs would become famous for helping strangers instead of intimidating them, I would have laughed. Now it seems like the most natural thing in the world. Dorothy smiled as she watched the visitors check their motorcycles and prepare their gear with the careful attention of people who understood that their safety depended on proper preparation. Harold used to say that the best way to change the world was one person at a time, one good deed at a time, one act of kindness building on another until the whole culture shifted toward something better. Think that's what we're doing? I think that's exactly what we're doing. And the beautiful thing is, we're just getting started. Outside, the Montana summer evening painted the valley in shades of gold and purple that never failed to take Dorothy's breath away. But tonight, instead of watching the sunset alone, she was surrounded by people who had traveled hundreds of miles just to say thank you for showing them a different way to live. The story that had begun with 15 strangers caught in a blizzard was becoming something larger, a demonstration that the antidote to isolation and fear was radical hospitality applied consistently across time and distance, one motorcycle, one traveler, one act of kindness at a time. As the visiting riders fired up their engines and pulled out of Dorothy's driveway, their taillights disappearing into the gathering darkness, she understood that she was witnessing the birth of something that would outlive them all. A network of human connection that had started with a simple decision to open her door to strangers and had grown into a movement that was changing how Americans thought about community, family, and the obligations they owed to fellow travelers on life's uncertain highways. The morning of August 15th dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every breath feel like a gift from heaven itself. Dorothy was in her kitchen preparing what had become her standard breakfast for unexpected visitors when she heard the first rumble of approaching motorcycles. But this sound was different from the usual small groups that had been arriving throughout the summer. Deeper, more sustained, like distant thunder that refused to fade. She walked to her front window and felt her heart skip as she took in the sight that greeted her. Motorcycles were streaming down the valley road in an endless procession, their chrome catching the morning sunlight like scattered diamonds. Not 15 bikes, not 50, but what appeared to be hundreds stretching back toward the horizon in a formation that seemed to go on forever. "Tommy," Dorothy called out to her young assistant, who was working on his laptop at the kitchen table. "Come look at this." Tommy appeared at her side and let out a low whistle of amazement. "Mrs. Henderson, I think word about today might have spread a little further than we expected." Today was the 1-year anniversary of the blizzard that had brought the iron wolves to Dorothy's door, and what had started as a simple idea for a small memorial gathering had apparently evolved into something much larger. Bear Mackenzie had called 2 weeks earlier to ask if Dorothy would be comfortable hosting a modest celebration of the Haven Network's first anniversary, expecting maybe 30 or 40 riders from regional clubs. The procession filling her valley suggested that Bear's definition of modest differed significantly from Dorothy's. The lead motorcycles were familiar. Bear's distinctive Road King Tank's modified touring bike, Preacher's vintage shovelhead that he maintained with religious devotion. Behind them came the rest of the original Iron Wolves riding in the same formation they had used that snowy December night. But behind them stretched a cavalcade that represented every corner of the motorcycle community Dorothy had come to know through the Haven network. "Dear Lord," Dorothy murmured as she watched the procession turn into her driveway and spread out across the surrounding fields. "How many people are there?" Tommy was frantically checking his phone, scrolling through messages from Haven network coordinators across the country. "According to Jake's GPS tracking, we've got riders from 37 states, plus a group that drove up from Mexico and another that flew in from Alaska. Total count is looking like somewhere around 400 bikes." Dorothy felt momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding on her property. 400 motorcycles meant at least that many people, probably more counting passengers. Her modest farmhouse, which had felt crowded with 15 visitors, would be completely inadequate for this gathering. But as she watched the riders dismount their machines and begin organizing themselves with military precision, Dorothy realized that these weren't tourists expecting to be entertained. These were experienced travelers who understood self-sufficiency and community cooperation. They had come prepared for camping, cooking, and creating their own accommodations while paying tribute to the place where their movement had begun. Bear was the first to reach her front door, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and concern about the response his invitation had generated. "Mrs. Henderson, I owe you an apology. When I sent out word about today's gathering, I expected maybe 50 riders. I had no idea it would turn into this." "How many are there really?" Dorothy asked, accepting Bear's embrace with the warmth of someone greeting family. "Final count is 423 motorcycles, 637 people total. We've got riders who drove 1,500 miles just to shake your hand and say thank you. Club presidents from organizations I've never even heard of. Military veterans, business executives, teachers, farmers, folks from every walk of life imaginable." Dorothy stepped onto her front porch and looked out at the sea of leather and chrome that had transformed her quiet valley into something resembling a small city. But instead of feeling invaded or overwhelmed, she felt honored. These people had traveled vast distances, not to take something from her, but to give something back. Their gratitude, their respect, and their commitment to the values she had demonstrated on a stormy night 12 months earlier. "Well then," Dorothy said with the practical decisiveness that had sustained her through 74 years of unexpected challenges, "I suppose we'd better figure out how to feed everyone." What followed was the most remarkable display of organized hospitality Dorothy had ever witnessed. The gathered riders transformed themselves into a logistical operation that would have impressed military planners dividing responsibilities based on individual skills and club specializations. The Wyoming Rough Riders, who included several professional chefs, took over meal preparation using portable equipment they had transported in support vehicles. The Colorado High Country Riders, many of whom worked in construction, began setting up a temporary stage and sound system for the evening's planned tributes. Maria Santos, now wearing the full patch of an Iron Wolves member rather than her old Prospect colors, appeared at Dorothy's side with a clipboard and the efficient demeanor of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to talk logistics. We've got people here who've been planning this for months, and they want to make sure you're comfortable with everything we have in mind." "What did you have in mind?" "Presentations from clubs that have used the Haven network to help stranded travelers. Testimonials from people whose lives were changed by the program. A formal dedication of this property as the unofficial headquarters of what folks are calling the New Brotherhood movement." Dorothy felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she processed the magnitude of what Maria was describing. A year ago, she had been a lonely widow, living in isolation, her only visitors, the occasional delivery truck or lost tourist. Today, her home was being declared the spiritual center of a nationwide movement that had touched thousands of lives. "Maria," Dorothy said softly, "I need you to understand something. I didn't do anything special that night. I just did what any decent person would do when fellow human beings needed help." "That's exactly why you're special," Maria replied firmly. "Most people wouldn't have done what you did. Most people would have been too scared, too suspicious, or too inconvenienced to open their door to 15 strangers in the middle of a blizzard. You didn't just save our lives that night, you showed us a different way to live." The afternoon unfolded with the easy rhythm of a well-organized festival, as riders shared stories, renewed friendships, and forged new connections across traditional club boundaries. Dorothy moved through the gathering like a beloved grandmother at a family reunion, listening to testimonials from people whose lives had been transformed by encounters with Haven Network hosts. There was Janet Williams, a widow from Nebraska, who had joined the network after her husband's death, and discovered that helping stranded travelers gave her life new purpose and meaning. She had personally assisted 43 riders over the past year, turning her farmhouse into a refuge for people caught in storms, mechanical breakdowns, or simply exhaustion from too many miles on dangerous roads. There was Marcus Steele Chen, a former gang member from Los Angeles, who had found redemption through the motorcycle community and now ran a non-profit organization that provided mechanical training to at-risk youth. He credited the Haven Network with showing him that strength could be measured by the ability to help others rather than hurt them. There was Rebecca Phoenix Martinez, a military veteran who had been battling PTSD and depression until she discovered the healing power of serving as a Haven Network host. Her home in Arizona had become a sanctuary for fellow veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life, offering not just shelter, but understanding from someone who had walked the same difficult path. "Mrs. Henderson," Rebecca said as they talked beside the memorial display that had been erected in Harold's honor, "I want you to know that your example saved my life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as I learned that my pain could become purpose if I used it to help other people heal." Each story added another layer to Dorothy's understanding of what had grown from that December night when she chose compassion over caution. The Haven Network had become more than an emergency assistance program. It had evolved into a philosophy of living that emphasized service to others as the path to personal fulfillment and community strength. As evening approached, the formal ceremonies began with Bear McKenzie taking the temporary stage that had been constructed in Dorothy's front yard. His voice carried clearly across the gathering as he addressed the assembled riders, his words carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of principled leadership. "Brothers and sisters," Bear began, his voice rough with emotion, "we're gathered here tonight to honor someone who changed our understanding of what it means to be strong, what it means to be family, and what it means to serve something larger than ourselves." The crowd grew quiet, hundreds of voices falling silent as Bear continued his tribute to the woman who had inspired their transformation. 1 year ago, 15 members of the Iron Wolves were caught in a blizzard that would have killed us if we hadn't found shelter. We pulled into Dorothy Henderson's driveway as strangers desperate and half-frozen. We left 3 days later as family, carrying with us a new understanding of how human beings should treat each other. Bear paused, looking directly at Dorothy, who was seated in a place of honor beside the stage. Dorothy Henderson didn't just save our lives that night. She saved our souls. She showed us that real strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. That real brotherhood includes anyone who needs help, not just people who wear the same patches. The applause that followed was thunderous, hundreds of voices raised in appreciation for the woman who had become the unlikely spiritual leader of their movement. But Bear wasn't finished. In the past year, the Haven Network has assisted over 3,000 stranded travelers. We've prevented dozens of deaths from exposure, mechanical failure, and medical emergencies. We've connected isolated people with communities of support. We've turned motorcycle clubs from objects of fear into symbols of hope. He gestured toward the gathered crowd, representing clubs from across North America who had embraced the philosophy Dorothy had demonstrated through her actions rather than her words. But more than that, we've learned that the greatest adventures don't happen on the road. They happen when we choose to care for each other, when we open our doors to strangers, when we transform our strength into service and our independence into interdependence. Tommy Morrison took the stage next, his transformation from angry prospect to community leader, representing one of the most dramatic examples of the Haven Network's impact. His voice was steady and confident as he addressed the crowd, bearing no resemblance to the defensive teenager who had arrived at Dorothy's door 8 months earlier. "Mrs. Henderson gave me more than shelter when I needed it," Tommy said. "She gave me purpose. She showed me that my pain could become power if I used it to help other people avoid the same struggles I had faced." He looked directly at Dorothy, his expression reflecting the gratitude of someone whose entire life trajectory had been changed by an elderly woman's willingness to see potential where others saw only problems. The Haven Network mobile app has been downloaded over 50,000 times. We've processed emergency assistance requests from every state and 3 Canadian provinces. But the technology is just the delivery system. The real power comes from people like Dorothy Henderson, who choose compassion over convenience every single day. The testimonials continued for over an hour, each speaker adding another dimension to the story of how individual kindness had multiplied into community transformation. Club presidents talked about how their organizations had shifted from insularity to service. Individual riders shared stories of personal redemption made possible by the acceptance and support they had found through the network. But the most powerful moment came when Jake Thompson, the computer programmer who had built the network's technological infrastructure, presented Dorothy with a framed certificate that represented something unprecedented in motorcycle culture. "Mrs. Henderson," Jake announced as Dorothy joined him on stage, "by unanimous vote of the Haven Network Advisory Council, representing 87 motorcycle clubs and over 10,000 individual members, you are hereby declared the first honorary president of the North American Motorcycle Brotherhood Alliance." The crowd erupted in celebration as Jake explained what this title meant. Dorothy would have no administrative responsibilities or obligations, but her name would be permanently associated with the movement's founding principles. Every Haven Network location would display her photograph alongside the organization's mission statement. Her story would be taught to new members as the foundational example of what their brotherhood represented. "I don't know what to say," Dorothy admitted as she accepted the certificate and looked out at hundreds of faces reflecting admiration, gratitude, and love. "Harold always said that kindness was like a campfire. It didn't cost anything to share, and it made everyone warmer. You've taken that simple idea and turned it into something beautiful." She paused, gathering her thoughts, as she prepared to address the largest audience she had ever faced. "When I opened my door to the Iron Wolves that December night, I wasn't thinking about starting a movement or changing the world. I was just trying to keep 15 human beings from freezing to death. But what I learned from that experience is that small acts of kindness have power beyond anything we can imagine when we perform them freely and without expectation of return." Dorothy's voice grew stronger as she continued, inspired by the sea of faces that reflected her own values back to her. You've proven that motorcycle clubs can be forces for good in their communities. You've shown that strength and compassion aren't opposites. They're partners. You've demonstrated that the greatest adventures happen when we choose to serve others rather than just serve ourselves. The celebration continued long into the night, with music provided by Wheels Morrison and dozens of other musicians who had traveled to honor Dorothy and celebrate the movement she had inspired. Campfires dotted the valley as riders shared stories and forged new friendships that would sustain them through future challenges. But Dorothy eventually retreated to her kitchen, seeking a few minutes of quiet reflection amid the joyful chaos that had transformed her property. She was standing at her window, watching the flickering campfires and listening to the distant sound of laughter and music when Bear Mackenzie found her. "Overwhelming?" Bear asked, joining her at the window. "Humbling," Dorothy replied. "To think that something so simple could grow into something so beautiful. Harold would have been amazed. Harold would have been proud. You took his values and lived them so authentically that you inspired hundreds of other people to do the same. That's not simple, Dorothy. That's miraculous." Dorothy smiled as she watched Tommy Morrison moving through the crowd, introducing himself to riders from distant states and sharing information about Haven Network programs. The angry defensive teenager had become a confident young man whose work was helping thousands of travelers find safety and community on America's highways. "You know what the best part is?" Dorothy said to Bear. "It's not mine anymore. It belongs to all of you now, all the people who've embraced the idea that we're responsible for each other's welfare. I planted a seed, but you're the ones who made it grow." As the weekend gathering drew to a close, Dorothy found herself saying goodbye to hundreds of people who had become extended family through shared commitment to mutual aid and community service. But these weren't sad goodbyes. They were promises to stay connected to continue building the network that had become the most positive force many of them had ever been part of. The procession that departed Dorothy's Valley on Sunday morning was even more impressive than the one that had arrived. 423 motorcycles departed in groups organized by geographical destination, each rider carrying stories and connections that would strengthen the Haven Network's reach and effectiveness. But 27 riders chose not to leave. These were people who had found something at Dorothy's farmhouse that they didn't want to abandon. A sense of purpose, community, and belonging that made geographic location less important than spiritual connection. With Dorothy's permission and Tommy's coordination, they established the first official Haven Network training center on land adjacent to her property. Using their combined resources and skills, they constructed facilities where new hosts could learn hospitality protocols, where stranded travelers could receive extended assistance, and where the movement's values could be preserved and transmitted to future generations. "It's perfect," Dorothy said to Tommy, as they watched construction crews put finishing touches on the new buildings. "Harold always dreamed of this land being used to help people. Now it's going to help people forever." Tommy, now 20 years old and serving as the Haven Network's Director of Operations, had grown into the kind of young man any parent would be proud to claim. His work coordinating assistance for stranded travelers had prevented dozens of deaths and created thousands of connections between people who might otherwise have remained strangers. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy said, as they stood together watching the sun set over the valley that had become headquarters for a movement spanning 2 continents. "I need you to know something. That night when I stepped off the bus in Whitefish, I was about as lost as a person could be. You didn't just give me shelter, you gave me a life worth living." Dorothy reached over and patted Tommy's shoulder, with the maternal affection she had never been able to give to children of her own. "Tommy Morrison, you gave yourself a life worth living. I just provided the right conditions for you to discover what was already inside you." 5 years later, Dorothy Henderson was sitting in her favorite chair beside the wood-burning stove, watching snow fall outside her kitchen window with the same sense of wonder that had sustained her through 79 winters in Montana. But the house was no longer quiet during snowstorms. It was filled with the voices of stranded travelers who had found their way to her door through the Haven Network's sophisticated dispatch system. Tonight's guests were a family from Florida, making their first motorcycle tour of the American West, caught by an unexpected November blizzard, just as the Iron Wolves had been caught 6 years earlier. Their teenage daughter was helping Dorothy prepare dinner, while their parents worked with Tommy to coordinate assistance for other travelers caught in the same storm system. "Mrs. Henderson," the young girl said, as she stirred a pot of Dorothy's famous storm stew. "My dad says you're the reason there's always someone to help when bikers get in trouble. Is that true?" Dorothy smiled as she watched snow pile against her windows, remembering another December night when 15 strangers had stumbled through her door and changed the trajectory of her life forever. "Honey, I think your dad might be giving me too much credit. The reason there's always someone to help is because good people recognize that we're all responsible for each other's welfare. I just happen to be in the right place at the right time to demonstrate what that looks like." Outside, the storm raged with the same fury that had trapped the Iron Wolves years earlier. But inside Dorothy Henderson's farmhouse, strangers were becoming family-isolated travelers, were finding community, and the simple act of opening doors to those who needed shelter continued to generate the kind of warmth that no blizzard could extinguish. The Haven Network had grown to include over 300 officially certified host locations across North America, with volunteer coordinators managing assistance requests 24 hours a day. Tommy Morrison had been featured on the cover of Motorcycle magazine as the young man revolutionizing rider safety, while Dorothy had been profiled in dozens of publications as the grandmother whose kindness had transformed motorcycle culture. But the statistics and publicity mattered less to Dorothy than the knowledge that somewhere tonight, in farmhouses and garages and spare bedrooms across the continent, strangers were treating each other like family, simply because they had learned that kindness was contagious and that small acts of compassion could grow into movements that changed the world. As Dorothy tucked quilts around her newest guests and banked the fire for the night, she understood that the story, which had begun with a blizzard and 15 frozen strangers, would continue long after she was gone. The Haven Network had become larger than any individual sustainable, beyond any single generation, a permanent fixture in the landscape of American hospitality that would shelter travelers through whatever storms the future might bring. The last thing Dorothy saw before sleep claimed her was the gentle glow of Tommy's laptop as he coordinated assistance for travelers across the storm-swept West, his fingers flying across keys that connected people in need with people ready to help, one emergency at a time, one act of kindness building on another, until the whole culture had shifted toward something better, warmer, and more human than what they had found when they first knocked on her door that December night, so many years ago. Outside, the Montana wind sang its ancient song of winter's power. But inside Dorothy Henderson's farmhouse, the warmth of human connection burned eternal, a beacon for all who would follow the example of the woman who had proven that sometimes the greatest adventures happen not on the road, but when we choose to open our doors to strangers and discover that we are all part of the same family, all travelers on the same uncertain journey, all deserving of shelter when the storms of life threaten to overwhelm us with their fury and their cold.